네, 여러분
Good
안녕하십니까?
afternoon.
오늘
I am the
진행을
moderator
맡은
for today's
한국해양수산개발원
event,
북방극지실의
Chesuran
최수란입니다.
from Korea
귀한
Maritime
시간
Institute.
내셔서
I would like to
아크틱
thank
커넥트 행사에
all of the
참여해 주신
participants who are
참가자
joining
여러분
us here today
대단히
at the Arctic
고맙습니다.
Connect
본
Conference.
행사는
Today's event
해양수산부가
is part
주최하는
of the 7th
제7회
Arctic
북극 아카데미
Academy
프로그램의 일환으로
hosted
개최되고요.
by
한국과
the
영어
Ministry
동시
of
통역이
Oceans and
제공이 됩니다.
Fisheries. Simultaneous
이번
interpretation
온라인으로
services
진행되는
will be
아크틱
provided.
커넥트는
The Arctic
여러분이
Connect Conference
몰랐던
held
경이로운
online
세계,
is an event that
북극을
introduces the
과학과
wondrous
인문사회
world of the
측면에서
Arctic with
바라보는 그런
various
새로운 시간이
speakers
되겠습니다.
on diverse topics.
모자익 코디네이터이자
Today's
노아
event will
지구
start with a
시스템
talk from
연구소의
MOSAIC's coordinator
과학자이신
and NOAA
매튜
Earth System Research
슈페님의
Laboratory
모자익 북극
scientist
원정대
Matthew
이야기를
Shoup on the
제일 먼저
MOSAiC
여러분께 소개해
Expedition.
드리겠습니다.
The
그리고 두
speech will be followed
번째로는
by
그린랜드
novelist
신화
and
이야기
creator
제작자
Kim
김인숙
In-suk
작가님의
on the
그린랜드
myths
신화
from
이야기가 준비가
Greenland.
되어 있고요. 세
A
번째로는
guide to
한국
monsters
괴물백과
novelist
저자이신
Kwak will
곽재식
then
작가님의
talk about
아시아
Asia, our
우리나라
country's
신화
story
이야기가
of the
준비가 되어
myths.
있습니다. 그리고 마지막으로
Afterwards,
북극 이야기
the
얼음
author of
빼고라는 책을
Arctic
쓰신
Without Ice
저자이신
and the Vice President of
한국해양수산개발원
Research of
김종덕
KMI, Kim
연구부원장님
Jong-duk,
모시고
will
북극에
join
대한
us in
이야기를
Let's Talk
나누는 다
Together,
함께
where we talk
이야기하기가
about
이렇게
the
네 세션으로
Arctic.
이어지겠습니다.
So there will be 4 sessions
방송
in
중간에
total.
생중계
For
중간에
those
강의와
who
관련해서
leave questions for
발표자분들께
our
질문을
speakers,
통해서
through a
질문
lucky
남겨주시는
draw,
분들 저희가
we
추첨을 통해서
will
온라인
provide
상품권 제공하고
prizes
있습니다.
to them.
유튜브로
So for
생중계
those
시청하고
tuning in
계시는
online,
여러분들의
I call
많은
for your
참여
avid
부탁드리겠습니다.
participation.
이벤트에 당첨되신
After
분들께는
the
저희가
conference, we
행사
will
종료 후에
contact the
별도로
lucky
연락을
winners
드릴 겁니다.
separately.
자, 그러면 네 번째 순서 중에서 이제 첫 번째
We
순서
will move on to the
매튜
first
슈페
sector of our
박사님의
conference,
모자익
which is a
북극
speech from Matthew
원정대입니다.
Shoup on the MOSAiC
이
Expedition.
연사를 먼저 소개해
Before we
드리면요.
welcome him to the
세계
stage, I would
최대
like to
규모의
briefly
북극
introduce him.
원정인
Dr.
모자익
Matthew Shoup is currently
프로그램의
the
공동
co-coordinator of the
코디네이터이자
MOSAiC
또 노아
Expedition, which
지구
is the
시스템
largest
연구소의
polar expedition.
과학자이십니다.
He is also the scientist of
1990년대부터
NOAA.
북극
From
대기와
1990, he
기후
has
변화 연구에
participated in
참여해
countless
오고
Arctic
계시고요.
atmospheric and
미국
climate change studies. He is also the member of the U.S. Department of Energy Biological Environmental Research Advisory Committee. Now, we would like to invite Matthew Shoup to the stage.
Okay, thank you very much for having me. I just shared my screen and I trust that you can all see the screen. I'm joining you today from Colorado in the United States, so it's in the middle of the night for me, but I definitely, I'm happy to join you here. And I would like to speak about MOSAiC. MOSAiC is the multidisciplinary drifting observatory for the study of Arctic climate. And I'll tell you some more details about what that means in a little bit. But basically, we went into the Arctic for a full year. And so this presentation will look at the challenges and the opportunities of spending a year in the Arctic sea ice. And you see a nice picture here of the Polar Stern icebreaker. This was our base of operations as it's sitting there in the Arctic winter, frozen into the sea ice. So one might ask, why would we want to go study the Arctic system? And that's a great question. The Arctic system is changing very rapidly. The sea ice is declining. The temperature changes in the Arctic are 3 times faster than the changes on the rest of the globe. There's lots of changes to the ecosystem, to fisheries. So many aspects of the Arctic system are changing. We also have very poor model predictive capabilities in the Arctic. We have these models that we've built for understanding the climate system, and they really struggle in the Arctic. Also, there are emerging operational and management needs. As the sea ice declines, it opens the Arctic to shipping, to resource development. There's so many issues that are emerging now as the Arctic changes, and we have to manage those. And there are also really important questions about how the changing Arctic is related to all of us that live at lower latitudes and how it affects things like the weather. And there are a lot of questions about how it affects the weather in Korea or in the United States. And so those are great questions for us to look at. And then, of course, there are very few observations in the Arctic relative to the rest of the world. And so we're challenged to then understand what's happening there. So these are some reasons why one might want to go and study the Arctic system. And indeed, that motivated a large group of international scientists to want to go into the Arctic. And so we started to put together plans for an expedition. And this plan was very international in nature, with the Arctic science community from all around the world, both Arctic nations and non-Arctic nations, working over the past 12 years to put together plans. We wanted to have an interdisciplinary project, one that looked at the atmosphere, the sea ice, the ocean, and looked at the physics, the chemistry, the biology that really cut across the system. We wanted to look at multiple scales, from very fine scales right near our ship to larger scales that might represent a model grid cell, how a model represents a system, and then all the way to a pan-Arctic scale all across the Arctic. We wanted to integrate observations and modeling activities because this is such an important way to take our observational knowledge and then to support the development of models that we need to understand how the Arctic is changing. And we wanted to be there for a full annual cycle, the whole year, to look at all the different seasons and how they affect the sea ice and other aspects of the system. This is a schematic of some of the science looking at in the atmosphere. I'll get a laser pointer up here to help. So lots of processes in the atmosphere, in the sea ice, in the ocean, looking at the ecosystem, looking at chemistry and transfer of fluxes of gases and energy and heat, all aspects of the system. But right at the top of this page is the leading science question that we, a large international group, agreed was the important science question that would guide our expedition. And that is, what are the causes and consequences of an evolving and diminished Arctic sea ice cover? So why is the sea ice declining, and what effect does that have on the Arctic system and the global system? That was our science question that motivated us. And so the plan is depicted here in this schematic, and it was to take the Polarstern icebreaker, this icebreaker from Germany, and to stick it out in the middle of the Arctic sea ice. And we would install all kinds of other buoys and other observing systems around the vessel in the sea ice. And then collectively, all of that would drift across the central Arctic along what's called the transpolar drift. And this is a pathway that we know happens. The ice moves across the Arctic kind of near the North Pole and out towards the Fram Strait, which is over between Greenland and Svalbard in the North Atlantic. Over the course of the year, we would have some aircraft that would make measurements around. We would have some other icebreakers and vessels that would help to exchange our people, bring new scientists, bring fuel and food and other supplies. So that was the basic concept. So a great question is, how did it go? Well, let's take that journey, and that's what I'll take you on here in the next few minutes. With lots of pictures, a little bit of science, and I hope you'll get the feel for what we were doing out there in the Central Arctic. Again, a nice picture here of the Polarstern icebreaker as it's frozen in the sea ice. And I'll show you a number of maps like this. This is a map looking down on the North Pole here, and it will show you the drift over the course of different periods for our year-long expedition. So this is for leg 1, is what it's called, the first group of scientists out there. And the little red squiggly line is where the vessel was drifting passively with the ice during this leg 1. And in these maps, I show you a couple of lines. Down here, you can see the edge of the sea ice, where the white is here. That's the edge of the sea ice in March, when the ice is the most expansive. And then there's also this gray line here, which is the edge of the ice in middle of September, when the ice has retreated the most. And these are just to give you some reference for where we're drifting in the Arctic relative to the ice extent at different seasons. So leg 1, what happened during leg 1? Well, first off, we had to load the ship with all kinds of science equipment. It was really packed with so much science and so many fantastic instruments. And then we headed out into the Arctic Ocean and into the ice pack. And so you can see here a number of very small ice flows. Eventually, they would get bigger and bigger as we went further into the sea ice. And then we found a couple of larger ice floes, and we started to explore those because we needed to find a nice piece of ice that would help last for a whole year. And that would be the base for our operations for conducting our science. And then after we found our ice floe, we started setting up all kinds of equipment around. So here are some huts out on the ice to keep us warm, and a variety of different installations. So here's an installation for looking at radiation that is emitted by the surface. Or here's someone working on putting together a meteorological tower. And then eventually that tower was raised here, and you can see it was lifted into place. There were so many different installations. Here's a picture of some people installing a buoy system, cutting a hole through the ice and putting that down so it could make measurements down in the ocean below and in the sea ice. And this is a really fantastic picture here. This is a picture from what's called Met City. It was one of our installations out on the sea ice. You can see the ship in the background there. And one thing that's really important about this picture is that it's dark. Very quickly after we got there, in the fall of 2019, the sun went down. And in polar night, the sun is down at this location for 4 months straight. The sun was below the horizon. And so this picture was taken in the middle of the day. And this was the middle of our day for 4 months in a row, where it was totally dark out. Pretty amazing out there, actually. But once we had all these things installed, we started a very comprehensive measurement and sampling program. Here's a picture of a gentleman looking at some of the snow, measuring all kinds of properties of the snow. We sampled the snow, we sampled sea ice, we sampled ocean water, we sampled air, all kinds of different samples and measurements all across the ice. And right from the beginning, the Arctic sea ice revealed itself as being very dynamic. So here's a picture from the side of the ship looking out at the ice, and you see these cracks in the ice. Wow, we were really nervous right from the start because the ice started breaking right where we were trying to be. So it kept us on our toes. Here's another nice picture looking out, and you see some installations out there away from the ship, and there's that big crack in the background. And at times those cracks come back together and create pressure ridges like mountain ranges. And you can see here the pressure ridge, it really ate up some of our power lines. You see some power lines here, and they just got totally consumed by the ice as it came back together. So this was part of the adventure as we started our expedition to learn about the ice. And this ice was going to be a big challenge for us for the whole year. Okay, let's move on to the second part, leg 2. We exchanged some of our scientific personnel, and then these people were out there from the middle of December until early March, and they did not see the sun the whole time they were out there. It was dark the whole time, and you can see the little part in yellow here where they went. So you can see the whole drift is starting to move across the central Arctic. Here's a very nice picture, a long exposure picture in the evening time, in the nighttime. So you see stars there. This is a sled-based system that measures the energy transfer at the surface. You can imagine that if you're interested in the sea ice and why it might be melting or growing or what's happening to it, well, you'd be interested in how the energy transfers between the atmosphere and the sea ice. And this was from my team, one of the sleds that we designed to measure all that energy transfer. And wouldn't you know it, well, the sea ice continued to be a challenge. One of our sleds like this, you can see, got tipped upside down. The ice continued to be dynamic for the whole year. And this was, of course, one of the biggest challenges, but it was also a huge opportunity for us to be embedded right in the middle of this very dynamic Arctic system. That's why we were there. Another of the really interesting aspects about being there in the wintertime is one might ask, what happens to the biology in the winter? You know, there's no sunlight to help photosynthesis. So what does the biology do? Well, that's a great question, and it's one that we're really working to answer now. We've collected all kinds of samples. You see some jars here that have little critters from the ocean, and people are studying that now to figure out what, in fact, were those things doing out there in the middle of winter when it was so dark. Okay, moving on to the third part of the expedition. And you see this is a very long part of the expedition in green here. And this was long because of the COVID pandemic. We actually had plans to rotate people sooner, but we could not get a vessel in there. We actually had a couple of vessels that could no longer travel during this really challenging time. And so the people that were out there were trapped out there for a couple of months longer than they had planned. So quite a challenge for them personally. And then, of course, for us trying to devise plans to get new people out there and rotate these people back home. It was also a really interesting time that I'll explain with this next diagram. So this is a plot of some data, and I'll try to explain what it is. This is looking down on the North Pole, and you can see on this side is Russia, and you can see Greenland, you can see Canada. So we're looking down on the Arctic, and what we're plotting here is what's called an anomaly of the winds. So how different were the winds during the January, February, and March of 2020? How different were they from normal? And that's what the colors are here. And what you see is right where we were with the ship, which is right about here at the end of this arrow, is this big green area. And that green area, if you look over on the side here, is 3.5 to 4 meters per second faster than normal. That was the wind speed. So that wind was blowing very fast, and it was blowing us along our drift faster than we had planned. And this was related to a number of different phenomena. The polar vortex, the winds that whip around the North Pole, were very strong during this winter of 2020. We had a record high Arctic Oscillation Index. This index is something that quantifies the large scale circulation. And this number was a record that higher than we've ever recorded before. So again, very strong winds that were circling around the Arctic. We also had a record large ozone hole in the Arctic this year. All these things kind of work together. And of course, we drifted across the Arctic faster than we planned. And as part of that drift, very fast, of course, the ice kept being dynamic. So here's a great picture looking at the polar stern. As the sun is very low, it's just come above the horizon, and you see, of course, all kinds of cracks in the ice again. We were right in the middle of a shear zone that was really causing the ice to continue to be very active. Here's another great picture looking from the ship out to camp. This is some of my equipment out here in the background, and you can imagine that the commute out to work was very challenging on this day to try to get across these open water cracks in the ice. So again, the ice kept us on our toes the whole year. I want to touch a little bit on some of the data that looks at the ice. And so this little graph shows over the course of time. So on the bottom axis, you see the months there, October through June. And in the vertical axis, you see depth. And what this is there are what's called a thermistor string. It's a string of temperature sensors going from the atmosphere, which is right near the top, through the sea ice, which is bounded by the white lines, down into the ocean below. Now, the ocean is at a very stable temperature at about -2 degrees Celsius. And the atmosphere temperature varies a lot. You get a warm air mass that comes in, or it gets very cold. And so it's kind of going back and forth. And then you can see how that variability in the atmosphere drives variability in the sea ice temperatures. And so that's really interesting to see how the sea ice is growing over the course of the winter and how the temperature structure in the ice is varying. And then as we move towards the right of the graph, all the way towards May and June, you start to see that the ice is warming up. This is as we move to the spring and towards the summer. The sea ice is warming and it starts to get to the melting point. And right at the end of this graph is when we really get to the melting season and the sea ice starts to melt. So these are some of the kinds of measurements we make to really understand how the ice evolves in time. Now moving on to leg 4. This was a fascinating leg right near the ice edge. And here's a great picture of the ice at this time. And what you can see here is the ship, of course, but you start to see melt ponds happening on top of the ice. So all the snow that's been there is starting to melt. And you can imagine it's challenging to make observations. We have to build bridges. There was so much that we had out there to make observations. You see a tethered balloon here. You see some towers and other infrastructure around. We took lots of ice cores, so pulling out a core of ice so you can look at the structure of that and many other details about that ice. We walked all around measuring the ice thickness or looking at the reflection of sunlight off of the surface. Here are some people that are making measurements down into the ocean. And this is what it looks like down in the ocean. It's a really fascinating picture underwater. So many great pictures and so many great measurements of the ocean, the ice, and the atmosphere all together. Now, at the end of leg 4, we reached the ice edge. And this was because we were moving much faster than we had planned. So to stay there for the rest of the year, we actually took the ship back up near the North Pole and installed it there to finish out the year. And there we reset our whole camp using helicopters and other devices to set our instruments up on the ice again. Here's a great picture of one of those sleds that I showed you before that's making measurements over one of those melt ponds and looking at the transition as it starts to move back towards freezing up season. Now the sea ice extent is shown in this plot, and you can see the annual cycle as a function of the month here, with the most ice here in March and the least in September. And most years are in this gray shaded area. That's the climatology, that's the long-term averages. But as we all know, recently the ice has been declining, and the record year, the record minimum was 2012, and our year, our MOSAiC year for 2020 was in blue here, and it was the second lowest sea ice extent ever on record. So it was a very extreme year, although not the most extreme ever. I want to start summarizing now, and just one slide here about by the numbers. We had 20 nations involved in funding MOSAiC, and you can see the flags of those nations. We had 37 nations of the participants that were there, 7 icebreakers, 80 institutions were represented, and more than 400 people went to the field, with more than $170 million spent. And at the bottom there, the coldest temperature we measured was minus 42.3 degrees Celsius. That's the coldest surface temperature. So to summarize, we had many challenges out there with MOSAiC, but these challenges brought us also opportunities to be there in the middle of the changing Arctic system. The ice was very thin, it was very dynamic, but that's kind of why we were there. We wanted to see how the ice is changing. How does thin ice interact with the rest of the system? We did tons of science. We packed in as much as possible, looking at all aspects of the Arctic system. We had very broad participation from the international community, from many different funding agencies, from many different scientific disciplines. And we built a lot of capacity. We trained a whole new generation of scientists for how to do field work. And we learned a lot about how do you conduct field work on very thin Arctic ice. And we've left this legacy of tons of data that's available for everybody to use and to do Arctic research. And all this data will help us to address some of our pressing regional and global needs. Like, why is the Arctic changing so rapidly? And how is that change affecting us back home? How is it affecting our winter snowfall or other aspects? And we're really just getting started, right? We've come home now with all this great data, and now we're starting to sit down to pull that data apart and to figure out what it means. So stay tuned for the progress we make. And what would a presentation like this be without a picture of polar bears? Of course, these are the furry, cuddly creatures that we did see quite a bit out there. They keep us on our toes. You have to stay alert, but they are extremely adorable, including this mom and cub that we saw out there. So with that, I'd like to say thank you for your attention. There's a couple of web pages here that have more information, and I'm happy to answer some questions later on when we get to that question period. So thank you very much.
네, 정말 유익한 그런
Yes,
이야기였습니다.
thank you for your insightful talk. Let's give Dr. Matthew Shop a warm round of applause.
네. 정말 해상도 높은 사진과 함께
Yes,
설명을
I really
듣고
enjoyed the
이해에
pictures in the
정말
presentation, and that
도움이
really helped understanding the
다음
presentation.
순서도 아주 재미있는
Now we will
순서가
listen to
기다리고
a
있는데요.
very
특별한
interesting
연사분을
speech
한번
from a very
모셔보도록
special
하겠습니다.
speaker.
2018년
She is a
한국 아카데미
2018 graduate of the
수료생이시네요.
Korean Arctic
이분은요,
Academy.
그린랜드 신화
Kim
이야기를
In-suk
주제로
is a web
개설해
editor
주실
and writer who writes for the Greenland Tourism Agency, and she will present a presentation on Greenland mythology. In fact, she visited Greenland in 2010 and visited 7 villages, and afterwards, this prompted her to study more about this region. Afterwards, she received her master's degree on Greenland's cultural heritage and the impact that climate change had at UCL London. She returned to Greenland in 2015, where she enrolled in Greenland University to start her social science master's degree. She traveled to many different nations to understand Greenland. In 2019, she published her book Living in Greenland and now works as a web editor for Visit Greenland. I do hope her long introduction did justice to how special our speaker is. Now let's invite her to the stage. Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Yes. Good afternoon. I am currently in Greenland right now. I currently reside in Nuuk, the capital of Greenland, and it's currently 6 in the morning here. It's daylight savings time, so there's an 11-hour time difference between Korea and Greenland, so when this is over, there will be a 12-hour difference. I'm sure that many of the news and documentaries on Greenland that you had seen before focus on the melting iceberg or polar bears. Today, I would like to talk about a part of Greenland that doesn't focus on glaciers or polar bears. We'll talk about Greenland's legends. First, a brief explanation of Greenland. The country is everything but dull. 85% of the land is covered in ice. So when you look at the world map, there's a big white island that looks like it's almost inhabitable at the top of the map. That island is in fact Greenland. It's actually the biggest island in the world. So the map you're looking at right now is drawn using the Mercator projection, so it's different from the real size of Greenland. In fact, the real came with a map that best represented Greenland's size, and this is the map. Interestingly, Greenland geologically is a part of the North American continent. On a side note, Greenland is great at handball. So a couple of days back, during the North American and Caribbean Games, Greenland won a silver medal in handball. Culture-wise, Greenland shares many similarities with Canada. And socially and politically, Greenland is close to Denmark and Northern Europe, so it has close ties with nations all around the world. Denmark colonized Greenland for about 300 years, which is why its influence is prevalent. Of course, no longer do the Inuit live in igloos, but Denmark culture is still prevalent in many different aspects. Those who reside in Greenland still frequently enjoy whale or sea meat. Like you can see from this picture above, this is a picture of whale meat. It's a dish that I enjoy as well. But normal office workers would, during the summertime or the weekends, go out to hunt reindeer or other animals. So they would enjoy this hunting a lot. Like such, cultural aspects that are unique to Greenland are still intact, but the food, culture, and even the way people speak here in Greenland are similar to Denmark. Greenland's national language is Greenlandic, but Dutch is often used as well. In fact, elementary school students starting from their first year in school learn Greenlandic, Dutch, and English. However, there are so many cases where you need to be fluent in Dutch to receive a higher education. Towns don't have a sufficient education system in place, so you would have to travel to bigger cities to enroll in high school. Moreover, if you want to major in an academic field not provided through the University of Greenland, then you would have to go to Denmark. The picture above is a high school graduation photo. What the students are wearing is the traditional dress of Greenland. You see their graduation caps. Denmark high school students wear the same caps when they graduate as well. The Inuit people take up 90% of Greenland's population. They are used to the long and harsh winters since they're exposed to these conditions for the past 4,000 years. Everything in Greenland depends on nature. Winter lasts for 9 months in Greenland. Especially the Inuit people, when a snowstorm or blizzard would hit, would find shelter in an igloo or elsewhere, and they would find shelter in these places and then use whale blubber to light their lamps and would gather around to keep themselves warm. Of course, stories would naturally be shared throughout the night as well. The Inuit people believed that everything from animals to even the smallest twig had a soul. So they believed that everything living had a soul. And they believed that human souls can inhibit animals. So there are a lot of stories that spin off from that belief. For the Inuit people who coexist with nature, such belief might not sound far-fetched. These stories were passed down from generation to generation until they were recorded by Knut Rasmussen. Rasmussen was a Greenlandic polar explorer, and his records of Greenlandic legends and culture are still cited even to this day. What's the first thing that comes to your mind when you think about Greenland? I'm sure you've all seen glaciers melting due to climate change, through TV news stories, or through documentaries. And of course, this is the reality. However, today, let's try to use our imagination a little bit more. Let's imagine that it's winter. I'm sure some of you will think about big white glaciers and the dancing northern lights. White nights take place in the summer where the sun is up all day. Near the end of August, night finally starts to fall, giving way to green lights that dance in the sky, the northern lights. Here in Nuuk, we're just starting to see them. You can only see the northern lights when it's really dark, so you would have to wait until midnight. Today, let's talk about the northern lights, otherwise known as auroras. Aurora comes from the Greenlandic word "exernik," and it means ball games. The Inuit people believe that the aurora was in fact a ball game between spirits who used a seal carcass as a ball. Parents would often scare their child so that they won't misbehave by saying the dead spirits would use your head as a ball if you don't start behaving. But in hindsight, the threat is a bit morbid. Parents would use this threat especially when their child wanted to play in the dark during winter. There are some who travel to Greenland to just see these lights. You can see these lights almost every day in the winter, bearing it's not snowing. Starting late August and up until September, the weather is just right for anyone to go out and enjoy these northern lights. You can see these lights even in the city, so you don't have to take time to travel to remote areas. Like this photo above, you can see the northern lights anywhere. I might sound ungrateful, but there are times in January and February when I see so many auroras that I don't even think to take a picture at all. They're up in the sky crying out for attention, but I just know that they're going to be there tomorrow again, which is why I just ignore it completely. Being used to something is indeed a very scary thing, is it not? Now, moving on to folklore and legends, the Inuit people were the first to use the word aurora. Greenlandic mythology often cases are weird and a bit gruesome, but very magical indeed. The next story I would like to tell you is the story of the Mother in the Deep. It's a Greenlandic legend that is a bit gruesome. More than one version of this story exists, but the most widely known is the following. The story I'm going to talk about right now is Mother in the Deep. Once upon a time, there's an orphan girl. The family that took care of this girl suddenly sets out to sea one day. Soon afterwards, this orphan finds herself in trouble. So people start to chase her down, and when they finally get to her, they attempt to throw her in the sea. The girl, to avoid drowning, holds on the boat for dear life, but her fingers are chopped off, and she slowly starts to drown. This is where the Mother of the Sea story starts.
And it is said that all of her fingers then turned into sea creatures. After a long time had passed, the Mother of the Sea was living in the deep sea with a giant body and very long hair. People polluted the sea, which destroyed her hair, and people hunted more than necessary, wasting a great deal of food. At such times, the mountains, fields, and seas, and all creatures residing in nature were summoned by the Mother of the Sea and protected in her hair. When all of the animals disappeared and people could no longer hunt, people visited an old shaman. The shaman dived deep underwater to find out what happened, and she met the Mother of the Sea. And she found the mother's hair all tangled up. Like I told you, when the mother was young, her fingers were all cut off, so the mother couldn't comb through her hair without any fingers. The shaman figured out what was happening as soon as she saw the mother and suggested using her own fingers to comb through the mother's hair. However, the Mother of the Sea takes a look at shaman and feels like she's too old to have any strength. The old shaman tells the Mother of the Sea that she knows the wrong deeds of people on land and combs through her hair. When this happens, all animals come out from the mother's hair and go back to nature. The shaman goes back to land, telling everybody what happened. People regret their mistakes and start loving and caring for nature. In the modern times, the Mother of the Sea is often thought of as a symbol for sea pollution and climate change. When we throw something into the sea, this creates a ripple effect. The people of Greenland believe that the Mother of Nature of sea would show her fury if they are not careful and throw rocks in the sea. In Nook, you can find a beautiful statue of the Mother of the Sea. It's hard to miss. So I'm sure that you'll see it if you come to Nook. When it's high tide, the water goes up to the mother's neck, and when it's low tide, you can see all the way to her feet. I hope you get the time to visit the statue when you visit Nook. Next, we will be talking about Kibitok. This word in Greenlandic means wanderer in nature. Those filled with a great sense of shame, anger, and sadness would leave their homes to wander about in the mountains or ice fields, alone or living in groups with other nomads. It is said that Kibitok wears big, loose clothes made from animal fur, shoes made out of animal leather, and it has red eyes with disheveled hair, a tanned face, full of beard. The book you're looking at right now is a collection of monster stories from Greenland mythology, and I brought it because it has a kibitok on the cover. It is said that people who come into contact with kibitok suffer severe life-threatening injuries, and if they want to have majestic magical powers like kibitok, they must go through various hardships and give up being mortal. So first of all, you have to endure the freezing cold for 5 days. And once you become a kibitok, you'll never die from the cold, and you will have no fear over having no home. Gibitoks are known to have the ability to talk to animals. And the first animal you eat after becoming a gibitok is very important because every time you open your mouth, you will make that animal's sound. If a female becomes a gibitok, the gibitok develops an exceptional sense of hearing. If you become a gibitok, you can also fly as well. So, when people go to the mountains and see strange things, the locals often here say that they have seen a gibitok. Gibitok was also used as a subject of a movie. One is a Danish film released in 1956 called Gibitok, where the story unfolds in Greenland. Another example is a horror film released in 2011, produced by the director Malik Kist. It's called Shadows in the Mountains. So it is a horror story. As you can see in the poster, you see the black shadow. That is the gibitok. Statistics show that around 19,000 people in Greenland have watched it, and considering that the total population is only 56,000, we can say that the movie was a huge success. When it was released, it was advertised as an action thriller, but the movie was scarier than expected, so the genre was changed to horror film later on. I'm no good with horror movies, so I have not seen the movie yet. I heard that you can watch it through Vimeo, so I put up a QR code. If you're curious, it would be good to check it out. This year, the sequel of the movie was released, but I haven't seen it yet because once again I'm scared. Next, we will move on to Tupilak. Tupilak is an object made of animals or human parts, and it is made for revenge. It's a voodoo doll of sorts. It's made in various forms depending on what it is made of, but generally it takes a very strange and ugly form. Recently, Tupilaks are mostly commonly made of reindeer's bones, and it is a popular tourist item. Some people in Greenland are even reluctant to have Tupilak in their homes. I have a Tupilak keychain, and I recently purchased a Tupilak mug as a gift, and the handle broke after using it for a month or two. I told my Greenland friends about this, and they said that it broke because Tupilaks were bad luck. The very last thing I want to introduce is a lucky charm called Angnoak. People in Greenland don't carry around talisman in their daily life. Rather, it is used when hunting. So when riding a dog sled or kayaking for a long time, it is said that the talisman brings good luck or protects the person. Of course, the meaning differs between families and regions. This is a scene from a music video of a band in Greenland called Nanook. If you look here, you can see a polar bear-shaped necklace made from reindeer bones, and this is what people take to go dog sledding. Now, the title of this song is Angnoak, talisman in English, so a lucky charm. On a side note, Nanook is one of the most famous bands in Greenland, and even if you can't understand the lyrics, their music is just great. If you're interested, search for Nanook on YouTube to enjoy many music videos with great music and beautiful images of Greenland. I recommend you look it up. Nanook has even performed in Japan, and the band sings all of their songs in Greenlandic. When I first heard Nanook's music, I remember listening to it intently, even though I didn't know what the band was talking about at all. The band has created a lot of music, and for those who are interested, I recommend the song called Nanook. So the name of the band. And I recommend the music video. I also have the QR code in the link. And in case you were wondering, Nanook means polar bear. And if you want to know more Greenlandic myths in detail, you can go to the YouTube link that you see. So please visit the link. So I've told you stories about Greenland myths and legends. I hope it was entertaining. I hope I can answer some of your questions later on. Thank you.
네, 잘 들었습니다.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. It was interesting to hear about this presentation. Thank you for your QR codes. I never heard about Greenland mythology, so it was a very interesting time for me to learn about Greenland mythology. It did seem a bit gruesome, but still it was very interesting and also very magical as well. Now, speaking of mythology, now since we heard about Greenland's mythology, let's move on to Korea's mythology. The next speaker, author Kwak Jae-sik, is known to many because he most recently starred in a very popular TV program called Yukizu. I am also an avid watcher of this TV programmer. He's the author of many science books like The Scientific Guide to Scary Stories and Kwak Jae-sik's Bacteria Expo. He's known in Korea for explaining mystical creatures through science. He also received a doctoral degree in mechanical engineering and is currently an employee at a chemical company and also an active author. Let us welcome author Kwak Jae-sik to the stage, who will deliver a speech on Asia and Korean mythology. Yes, thank you for your introduction. Can you hear me and see this PPT well? Now we'll move on to Asia and Korean mythology. I'm sure you've heard about my brief introduction, and I wanted to add that I was a chemical employee, but now I am not because of many economic uncertainties due to COVID-19. But still, thank you for that brief introduction. I am an author, full-time author, and I enjoy writing many science fiction novels. So, I am a current author right now. Now, we recently heard about Greenland mythology, and I don't know much about Greenland mythology, so I was really worried about this presentation. But thankfully, after doing much research, I was able to learn more about Greenland mythology, and I saw that there was a similarity between Greenland mythology and Korean mythology. So it was very pleasing for me since I'm always interested in Korean mythology. So I would like to talk more about Korean mythology and go into the details of this topic. Now, I wanted to mention that it might seem like an obvious point to mention, but in the past, we often said that the most Korean traditional characteristic that we have, which sets us apart from foreign countries, are all stories that we heard in the past, and we all know about these different characteristics. But of course, there are similarities as well. I am a Korean mythological expert, but I've come to understand that there are many similarities to foreign countries when it comes to creatures, mythical creatures, and monsters. Like mentioned before, Greenland mythology is also very similar to Korean mythology. So, of course, Korea's population size is similar to that of Greenland in the past, so of course there would be similarities to their mythology as well. So it was very interesting to hear about Greenland mythology. Now let's move on to the aurora. I'm very interested in this topic personally. So, of course, there are no northern lights in Korea, but let me introduce to you a new story. It was the records from the Joseon Dynasty from 1701. During that time, there was a record about a flying saucer that suddenly came in Seoul. It came with weird noise, and so people looked up at the sky to see what this flying saucer was. And right at that time, it was nearing the evening time, there was the same saucer that was witnessed here in Busan. So there were so many different witness accounts about a saucer or a flying UFO during the Joseon Dynasty. It was witnessed in Seoul and was also witnessed in Busan as well. So it starts that there was a flying saucer, which was the UFO that people had saw, and it changed, and it was as long as the height of 10 people put together. I think it's around 10 meters to 20 meters. So it was very tall. Its colors would change from red to white, and therefore it was very colorful. And the people said back then that the head and feet were hidden from view, but for those who had seen the head, it looked like the head of a dragon. So this is the records from the Joseon Dynasty. Since I am an SF novelist, I want to use this as to write my novels. And personally, I believe that this might be classified as a UFO, and the aliens had visited Joseon. Since it looked like a saucer, it could look similar to that of a UFO. So I think that this is very interesting, and it was very colorful, like the records I mentioned, like an UFO. And then you can imagine an alien looking down at the Joseon Dynasty citizens. So this is just my imagination and my perspective and my take on this story. The Joseon people, however, thought that this was a warning that the gods were giving to them. So they thought that they needed to be prepared for anything that was to come. So as an SF novelist, I am very interested in this part. Now, historians would say that this UFO was indeed the Northern Light. Like we had seen before, the Northern Lights are green lights, but it's not proven specifically scientifically yet. It unusually can happen not in the Arctic region, but in regions much more lower, so in South Korea. And if it goes down lower, then it changes colors from green to red, which might account for why the records would say that the colors would change from red to white. So historians and scientists believe that this might have been an aurora. And therefore, this was the first time actually of a written account about these northern lights. So it is indeed a very unusual phenomenon. Like mentioned before, there is different mythology that explains northern lights in Greenland, but in the Joseon Dynasty, we believe that the aurora was actually a warning that the gods were going to give. In fact, not soon afterwards, during the 20th century, there were also similar accounts that they saw a northern light sighting. So it wasn't seen correctly, but there was a camera image of a vague northern light image that did take place in Korea around 1940 to 1950. So this might be the Joseon Dynasty records might be explaining an aurora. Now let's move on to the Mother of the Sea mythology. There's a similar mythology during the Baekje and Silla kingdoms. So when Baekje was crumbling down, many people thought that there were many warnings that helped predict this eventual demise. So in the history of the three kingdoms in 660, there was the ocean's color turned as red as blood. Now, many people were curious about why suddenly the ocean's color changed. And then afterwards, in another record, there was a record of a female corpse that was found in the Southern Sea. And this female corpse was apparently 20 meters long. So it's a very, very long corpse, almost close to a giant actually. So what we can predict from this prediction is that there might have been a goddess that died, and that carcass was found later on, and since she died, her blood made the sea turn entirely red. Eventually, like mentioned before, Pekje does come to its demise. So finding this corpse, many people thought was a warning that Pekje was going to fall. So there was another warning. There apparently was a mother goddess that protected Pekje, the kingdom of Pekje. But when the constellation Cheonggusang fell, she also apparently died as well. So this was also a reason why the kingdom of Pekje fell as well. Now, we heard about Greenland's myth of the mother of the sea, but we also have a similar myth. She was the goddess and protector of the Pekje kingdom. In Pohang, there's also a very monumentous and very important construction, and that is related to this mythology. So all of these records are, of course, records about bad luck and warnings. And like mentioned before, usually these records would talk about how oceans would turn red, which was, of course, a bad sign. Back then, the king, when they saw this, believed that it was also because a constellation fell from the sky. Of course, this isn't scientific knowledge, of course, because a constellation doesn't fall from the sky. It might have been a meteor shower, but I think it might have been because of many scientific occurrences that could have turned the water red for some time. So it might have been a temporary occurrence. Now, the Gebidok legend is very similar to Korea's goblin monster. So let's talk about this monster. It is the most well-known Korean monster ever, and when we think about monsters and the goblin, we think of the horns on top of their head. So this is because goblins are very popular. But if we look at past records, there is no set definition of what a goblin actually looks like. There was a poem written by King Sejong, and he writes a poem about the monster. He says that it was depicted as having horns on his head, blood-red eyes, and sharp nails. It's very different from the goblin that we are aware of right now. In fact, he calls this goblin Yacha, which is a Buddhist spirit. So this could imply that the spirit Yacha is similar to the Korean goblin. And it might be because many people just started to call any monster that they saw goblins.
So, I think that this is a myth of the Joseon dynasty that is actually similar to Gibidok. I'm going to be talking about Anshigek and other mythologies about gods. So because it has a rich storyline, I want to focus on 안식에. There's a book called 증보해동이적 in Joseon Dynasty. During the 고구려 times, in the Great Battle of Anshizong, I'm sure many of you know about this great battle. We heard about such great soldiers fighting in the Tang Kingdom, the Kingdom of Tang. I'm not sure if many of you know about this. From Joseon to 고구려 Kingdom, so around 1,000 years, this was a big issue. A person in the deep mountains found a human-like creature that wasn't a human, but a creature with fur covering its body. And when the person asked about this creature, the creature answered that he was a soldier in the Great Battle of Anshizong, but he had fled from the battlefield 1,000 years ago. He didn't have anywhere to go, so he went deep into the mountains and hid there. There wasn't anything to eat, so he picked berries from the mountains. And he didn't enjoy the meals that people usually had, like rice. He just had to feed off the berries. So his body changed, and he saw fur spreading out of his body, and he became one with nature. He became immortal, and that is why he is living for more than 1,000 years. He was shamed that he changed, and he didn't make appearances in the human society, and he continues to live in the mountains. This was the confession from 안식에. Apart from stories of 안식에, we can also hear of stories of people going out into the nature and living with nature and seeing fur cover their bodies and becoming immortal. There's myths like this in Korea. There's several actually. And I think a lot of people in the old days believed in such myths. We can say that it's similar to the story of a Taoist hermit with miraculous power story from China. And the story from China is about people who don't eat any crops and who live in the mountains and live forever. And the story that originated from China actually was more popular in Korea. So I think that this has different characteristics from the story of Gibitok in Greenland, because the one from Greenland is quite scary. But in Joseon, the story about the creatures that live forever in mountains with furs covering their bodies are more positive, yearning stories. And the concept of living in the mountains without any human food and getting good health is a story that is a narrative that we heard often in the Joseon Dynasty, and many people still think about becoming one with nature even to this day in Korea. We see programs like Taeyeon, people living in nature. So it's something that we hear in the narrative of the 21st century people. So I believe that the story of 안식에 in the Joseon Dynasty was a powerful story that passed down for generations. Now let's think about the way people of the Joseon Dynasty cursed other people. There's a lot of diverse curses, and one widespread method was getting the bones of a deceased person or animal and hiding the bone near a person that you wanted to curse. So hiding the bone in the front yard of a person that you hated or your enemy. If that happened, then the person you hated was cursed. Now, there's a story of Hwangcheol in Ouyadam. He is like a ghostbuster, to put it in Western terms, and we can read stories of what he did. A person suddenly became ill, and the person wouldn't get better. So the family members were wondering what was happening. And the family members went to Hwangcheol and asked if the family member was possessed. Hwangcheol did some tricks, and that day, in the front yard, small, bright particles flew up like fireflies. It seemed as if hundreds of fireflies gathered as one, and it became a big circle of fireflies almost, and it resembled a human skull. After all of that activity, it actually turned into a human skull. And when Hwang Cheol burned the human skull, the curse was erased and the curse was reversed. So, Hwang Cheol told the family members that somebody who hated the family was trying to curse the family. And the tale is that if you burn the skull, then you can reverse the spell. You can grind up skulls and cast a spell on people you hate. And if you gather the powder of the skull and make it resemble a skull and then burn the skull, you can reverse the spell. Such sayings were common in Joseon, in the Joseon kingdom. And in record, we can see that people of the kingdom, of course, were more dexterous in their ways. So, in records of the kingdoms of Joseon, we can see detailed ways of putting curses on people. Like if you want to curse a woman, you can grind up the person's makeup products. So there were many ways to go about it, and there were many rumors which are all recorded in old documents. Now let's go on to the token of luck. This is a token of luck that was used commonly until the 1950s. And traditionally, the token of luck is known to have been around for a long time, but in fact, the history of the token of luck is not that long. The history of writing on the token of luck and drawing hasn't been around that long. Even 60 to 70 years ago, the tokens of luck at those times were different from the tokens of luck we see now. And if we were to talk about the bestseller token of luck, we can talk about the Silla Kingdom and the token of luck from Queen Sundok, which prevented fires. It was the first widespread token of luck to be used in the Silla dynasty, and we see the story in the Encyclopedia of the Joseon dynasty. Now we see a story about a ghost that was engulfed in fire. Queen Sundok, in order to ease that ghost's mind, came up with this spell, and that spell is used in the token of luck. So as I mentioned in the beginning, the myths of Korea are in many ways similar to the myths of Greenland. And we can see that there's a lot of universal factors in these myths. In the 1970s and 80s, it was said that Korea was a less advanced country, and people thought, how can we set ourselves apart from countries like Japan and China? What is our culture's uniqueness? There was a time when we thought about those aspects. So we thought about what are the unique characteristics of Korean monsters, Korean mythological creatures, mystical creatures. I think now, culturally, Korea is very developed. So nowadays, we do not need to focus intently on the uniqueness of Korean mystical cultures. I think that the myths and stories from Korea can have many commonalities with other stories from other countries, so we should enjoy those aspects. Thank you. Thank you for the presentation on Asian and Korean mythology. It seems like Greenland and Korea are half a world away, but there's a lot of commonalities between the stories of those two countries. We have heard from 3 speakers, and last but not least, we have prepared the last session, and we We'll
여러분들께서 이제 계속해서 저희 유튜브
have the session with researcher Kim Jong-duk, the current vice head for KMI. We have gathered questions in advance, and based off those questions, we will conduct the Q&A session. Here with us, we have researcher Kim Jong-duk.
Kim Jong-duk, researcher, has participated in approximately 100 different Arctic-related conferences from both home and abroad and engaged in 33 fieldwork operations. He had went to the Arctic for 33 times, so this is of course a very significant number, and he is indeed an expert on Arctic issues. He also leads Arctic policy in Korea and is the author of the book The Arctic Minus the Ice. Now we will welcome Kim Jong-duk to the stage. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I am Kim Jong-duk, a researcher. So thank you for participating in this conference. This Arctic conference is an international conference that's being held online, and it's an occasion where we engage in many different discussions in the Arctic, which is changing rapidly. I've been to the Arctic for many different times, and I've also engaged in many different discussions when it comes to the Arctic. The Arctic is indeed changing drastically, but the social, historical, and cultural meaning that the Arctic holds to the international community still stays the same. I do hope that the Arctic Connect will become a future platform where we can engage with the world on Arctic issues. So now let's move on to the Q&A session. Let's first answer the questions that we received in advance. First, let's move on to a question for Dr. Matthew Hsu. This MOSAiC project is evaluated to have taken climate change research to the next level. Above all, it is very meaningful that not only Arctic countries but also non-Arctic countries participated in the largest international joint research project in the Arctic Ocean. What do you think is the role and contribution that Korea played in this project? I would like to hear your answer.
Well, thank you for that question. That's a great question. And Korea played a very important role in this. As I said in my presentation, the whole planning for this activity took many, many years. And importantly, early on, a number of Korean scientists played very important roles as we were having those discussions to determine what are the priority research areas that we need to study. And in particular, Korea has some very fantastic global climate modelers who model the global system and to understand how does the Arctic and its change relate to what's happening at lower latitudes. And so this was really an important foundation for defining the science that we wanted to accomplish out there at MOSAiC. So a lot in the planning stages. And also, it was really important in harnessing Korea's lengthy experience in Arctic research over at least 20 years, both from land-based stations and from the icebreaker Aron, which has been out to the Arctic many times. So this was very important. And then during the mission, Korea led an effort to provide a lot of very important satellite measurements of the sea ice, to provide this spatial context for the sea ice and how it's changing over time. I mentioned a lot of the dynamics that are happening and, of course, the melting and freezing that's happening. And so these satellite pictures and images and how they changed over time were really important backbone for understanding the sea ice. So those were a couple key ways in which Korea participated in MOSAiC in very important ways.
Yes, thank you. There are two additional questions. So moving on, the Arctic is key in climate change. We have to explore and discover to study about this region continuously. However, this is a matter of concern that human activities might cause pollution. What's your opinion about this?
Yeah, human activities certainly affect the Arctic. I'm not totally sure about the question specifically, but human activities generally are leading to lots of changes on the global system, which certainly affects the Arctic. Right, rising global temperatures affects the Arctic and melt. But I think also the question is about what is the effect that we as scientists have on the Arctic system when we go there to make measurements, and that's also a really important one. We take ships there and ships pollute, or we take all kinds of other devices that we put out on the sea ice to make measurements. And those do have an effect on the Arctic system. Every time we drive a ship through the ice, we break the ice and we add some pollution. For MOSAiC, what we did actually is we have a whole group of people that's our sustainability group, and it's looking at the effect of our scientific activities on the environment that we're studying, so that we can hopefully in the long run improve our technologies so that we can have a smaller impact on the Arctic while we can still get the same great measurements that we want to get. And so we hope that this group will actually help us make progress in this area.
Now let's move on to the third question. What was some of the most exciting and memorable moments during the expedition?
The Arctic is exciting and memorable every time I go there. I've been going there for more than 20 years. Of course, the first time as you're sailing the ship into the Arctic and you see the sea ice, that's really exciting. And also when you see polar bears, we must have seen 20 or more than 20 polar bears. And of course, it's exciting every time. But I would say the most exciting part for myself was very early on in the mission, we were standing out on the sea ice and we were setting up equipment. And then I felt this tremor and I heard this noise and I looked down between my feet and there was a crack in the sea ice that went right between my feet as we were setting up our equipment. And so this was a super exciting time. And of course, it's very memorable for me. It also was a time that I got very anxious because we were just setting our equipment up for the first time and already there were cracks going right underneath our feet, literally. So that was a very exciting time as well. And there were many others. The Arctic is full of fascinating scenes. We saw in one of the presentations tonight, aurora, and there's all kinds of really fantastic optical phenomenon that happen in the atmosphere. And of course, polar bears and other animals. So it's really a fantastic place.
Now, we will first receive the questions that we received currently right now. But before that, let's move on to questions for author Kim In-soo. Good afternoon. So there are 3 questions that we've received. Let's move on to the first question. What do you think is the most attractive thing about Greenland? And what made you want to go back to Greenland and live there? Yes, I traveled to Greenland, and back then when I traveled to Greenland, I didn't have a clear objective in mind, meaning that I didn't want to live there at first, but as I spent more time in Greenland, I've come to realize how beautiful that place is. I first visited Greenland in 2010, and I visited 7 different villages in Greenland. And there was one village that I went to that's left a great impression on me. It is a village that I visited during a very important holiday in Greenland. So I went to an elementary school and saw many kids wear traditional Greenland clothes. It was actually a graduation ceremony that I watched. And afterwards, I hear someone calling me and calling other people. At first, I was a bit surprised because I naturally thought that no one would call me because I'm just a lone traveler, but it was a person calling me. So I looked back and saw that there was a grandmother who had asked me to come over to a home party because her grandson was graduating. It was a complete stranger to her, but she invited me to this home party. And when I went to that home party, there were people who wore traditional Greenlandic clothing, and so many people were just having a good time, enjoying cake and enjoying each other's presents. So apparently afterwards, I found that this is a part of Greenlandic culture. Because Greenland or the community is so small, a lot of people would invite strangers or tourists, and they would ask them to come over to their outings and events. This culture was indeed enticing to me. Yes, thank you. Greenland. The second question is, are there any similarities between South Korea and Greenland? Anything about culture, people, food, weather, and so on? So, what are the similarities between South Korea and Greenland? Yes. Of course, the culture, food, weather is very different from South Korea here at Greenland, but there are also similarities as well. So, one thing that I would like to point out is that Greenlandic people are very interested in Korea, Korean culture, and the nation as a whole. There's actually a Facebook group that's dedicated to people who are interested in Korean culture, Korean food, and so on. Also, my colleagues and I would often visit the Asian supermarket to try out Korean food. So a lot of people here love Korean culture and are interested in Korean culture. They would buy Korean ingredients and to make Korean dishes.
Greenland is far away, of course, from Korea. I have a last question to ask. Now, as you know, in Korea, there's superstitions. Some Korean superstitions say that we cannot write people's name in a red pen and we have to avoid the number 4. Do Greenlanders have similar superstitions? Is there any taboo? Yes. As I was preparing my presentation, I asked other people in Greenland and I learned some taboos, so I want to talk about these taboos. People say that if you get mushrooms from the mountains, it's going to rain. And so you have to finish all of the food on your plate. Otherwise, the weather is going to be bad the next day. Also, when you're out hunting, you have to come back when the sun's still up. Now, if you don't, there's a superstition that the gibitok is going to steal what you hunted. Also, if you have an itchy right foot, then you're going to get money. If you have an itchy left foot, then you're going to lose money. Also, you know how in Korea we don't have the floor number 4 in Korea because it's bad luck? Similarly, here in Greenland, we don't have the 13th floor in high buildings in Greenland. Oh, I see that there's a lot of similarities between Korea and Greenland taboos. So we have some questions for the next speaker, Kwak Jae-seok. When we take a look at different mythologies, it seems that ancients made their fears into images of monsters depending on the era and the region. What would be common source of fear that made people of Asia, Europe, and even in the Arctic? Well, if we're going to be talking about the common denominator, the common factor, it's not going to be easy. I think out of my speech today, we can think of the aurora. When we think of the aurora today, we think of it as a beautiful northern lake, something that we want to visit and see. And in Greenland, I heard that aurora is a scary tale, and in the Joseon dynasty, the aurora was almost like a catastrophe. Such lights appearing in the sky was just unfathomable. People thought that the kingdom was going to be demolished, and we see such records in old documents in Korea. So when we think of all those aspects, we can see that certain characteristics or phenomenons of nature that we couldn't understand were feared by people because people didn't know what those events meant. So people made their own reasons and logic for such natural phenomena, and this is how we got ghosts, dragons, and other mythical creatures to explain for some natural phenomena. I think that's the logic that we can think of. Now, compared to the old days, in the current times, we have greatly advanced science, so we know that auroras are scientific happenings. There's a reason behind why we see such phenomena. It's just an astronomical happening that happens because of some weather factors. So now we can enjoy such Nordic lights. And I think if we can see the aurora in Korea, people would be very happy. It would be something we would see in the newspaper. But in the old days, it was seen as a sign that a kingdom was going to perish. So I think the fear about natural phenomena that come from a lack of knowledge is the common denominator. Yes, I think things that we don't know are the most scary, and science plays a big factor in preventing such fears. The second question is, there are different types of monster figures created in different times and place. Are there any standards? For instance, is there a difference between a monster figure in a Buddhist region and a monster figure in a region where Islamic is prevalent? This also is not an easy question to answer. Today, based on today's talk, I think we can say that religion plays a big part in stories of monsters. I talked about the story of dokkaebi and yacha in Buddhism. Yacha is derived from yakusha, which is a part of ancient Indian culture. That turned into yacha in Buddhism, and that, of course, indirectly affected the dokkaebi culture in Korea. So we can see how the Buddhist culture was affected by Islamic culture and vice versa in many cultural cases. But today, I want to talk about a completely opposite case. So not cultures that are affected by each other. Now, when we interpret many myths and stories and ghosts and tales, we think about the conventional wisdom in a region, and we try to apply that conventional wisdom of a region. For instance, when we think of some tales in Indonesia, we automatically think that it would have been affected by Islam. And in the past, something that was notable about Indonesia was that people believed in Islam, although it was a part of Asia. And that's why we only focus on religion when we look at the tales of the district. We think that religion would have affected the region greatly. And even if we look at the characteristics of animals and weather conditions, we can see that all of those have effect of regions' culture. So it's not just religion that plays a part. There's many different characteristics of a region that come into play in explaining the area's culture. So I think that we can say that there's a comprehensive range of factors that play a factor. And I think that all of those play a part in creating the culture that we know. Yes, we have a last question. A year ago, I saw an article that there was a discovery of a monster which lived in the lakes underneath Antarctica's ice. This monster is famous for surviving in unfavorable conditions. Many people think that newly discovered creatures are monsters. Do you have any plans to publish sci-fi books about monsters of the deep sea that wake up from melting Arctic ice due to the effects of global warming?
제가 낸 책 중에
There is
괴물
a
이야기를 여러 작가들이
book
써가지고 모아서 낸 책이 한 권
that
있는데
I
그
published. It's a
책에
collection
이미
of many
이심의
monster
괴물 이야기 하나
stories,
쓴 적이 있죠.
and I have already written about an underwater monster that lives deep in the sea. You can read that if you're interested.
전자책으로 또
And
글 있어. 뭐한
I'm going to be
2-3주 넘어갈 것
publishing
같아요.
another
나오는
audiobook soon,
단편 소설 중에도
in
오늘
2 to 3
시대의
weeks.
거가 나오는 건 아닌데 그
And
전설 속에
it's
나오는
not about the
괴물이
deep sea,
굉장히 오랫동안
but it is
발견되지
about
않고 있다가 갑자기
a
현대에
legend
발견되어서
that wasn't
이상소동을
discovered
일으킨다는 그런 이야기는 제가 썼어요.
for a long
오늘 나올
time,
예정이니까
that was
봐주시면
discovered
감사하겠습니다.
recently. So I hope that you will read this book if you're interested.
현장에 실시간으로 질문들이
We have real-time questions coming in,
그중에 몇 개를 골라서
and we will
참석하신
choose some of these questions
여쭤보는 시간 좀 갖도록 하겠습니다.
and
첫
ask
번째
the
질문은
speakers.
매튜 박사님께 질문이
The first
왔습니다.
question is for Matthew.
코로나19를
Yes, the
계기로
question is the following. Due to COVID-19, of course, joint collaboration has unfortunately seen a halt because there was restrictions in movements between borders. Therefore, I believe that there might have been a barrier to engage with other researchers around the world. So the question is, in the post-COVID-19 era, will there be any changes in joint research?
매튜 박사님
So I would like to ask this question.
Wow, that's a great question. And I think that we will all have to experience what the answer is to that question as we go forward. Certainly, the world is a new place now. And, MOSAiC was one great example of international collaboration. And I certainly hope that the COVID pandemic will not damage those great collaborations, because it is so important, especially as we study the Arctic region, which is a very international region. It's so important that we work together. And I think that we will continue to do that, even though we have the challenge of COVID right now and potentially other pandemics in the future. I think that in the end, we have to find a way to get beyond those pandemics and continue to work together so that we can really answer these important questions that we all share about why the Arctic is changing and how it's changing.
네, 또 질문이 또 와
Yes,
있는데
there is another
저한테 질문이
question
와
for me, actually. So the question is that in the Arctic, there are many policies and governance systems, or is there these policies pertained only to the Arctic member states? Yes, of course, there are unique and genuine governance systems and policies.
하나 예를
Yes,
들자면
for one example would be the Arctic Council. This is a governance council indeed that looks over the 8 Arctic member states. It is a well-recognized governance council. We received an observer stance in 2013. So this
지역사회 문제를 논의하기 위한
focuses on many different Arctic issues. It was first launched in the late 20th century, and every 2 years, Arctic ministers would come together to convene a very important conference which will look into the 2 years in the future. This governing council has a working council as well that focuses on biodiversity and environmental problems as well as climate change problems. So these are a wide variety of problems that we focus on. The Arctic Council has many different characteristics, one of which is that the indigenous people also participate in this council. That is one characteristic that sets it apart from the rest. 6 indigenous groups are engaging in this council. and they put in their input in resolving many different problems that revolve around the Arctic. So the indigenous people, since they live in the Arctic, they receive many different impacts from the changes of the Arctic. So they are an active actor in resolving these problems. Yes, this is the answer to that question. Now let's move on to the third question for author Kim In-soo. So, I am an avid blog follower of yours and I really enjoyed your speech. Could you talk more about the traditional Inuit culture? And is there any part of the culture that is still preserved even to this day? So, could you answer this question, please? Yes. Can you hear me? Yes, so we'll move on to the answer. So, traditional Greenlandic clothes are still the same. It looks the same from in the past and still is the same. So, it is made out of leather, and that is the traditional clothes that people still wear even to this day. In regards to food, the food is the same as well. They still eat whale meat, and like I said in the presentation, whale and seal meat, which is a traditional dish, is still often eaten.
예, 제가 그린란드를 방문했을 때
So when I visited Greenland,
마을에 가서
I remember going to a very small town and being served with whale soup. It was actually tastier than I expected it to be. You can also eat whale meat in Busan, and
이런 음식 문화를 통해서
I think through such food culture, people can maintain their health and their traditions.
힘을 얻었구나 하는 생각을 한 적이 있습니다.
I think that's the basis of their
지금
strength.
실시간으로 올라오는 질문은 순서 없이 막
So
올라오기 때문에
we have many real-time questions coming in. They're not in any order. So I'm sorry that I can't ask speakers in turn these questions.
작가님께 또
We have a
질문하겠습니다.
question for novelist Kwak Jae-sik.
작가님 이제 저술 활동에 더 집중하실 것 같은데요.
I think that you're going to be
계획하고
focusing
계시는
more on
신비소설이나
writing in the future. Do you have any novels that you're planning to
혹시 오늘
write?
소개해 주신
And
북극 지방까지 통할 수 있는 보편적인 우리나라 귀신들을
Is-
소재로 작품 활동
and do you have any plans to write about Korean ghosts that could even impact the Arctic culture? Well, if you look it up on the internet,
잘 들리시나요?
can you hear me?
네, 아파트 생물학이라고
Yes,
하는
so
제
there's a
책이
book that I created, The Apartment
올라와 있습니다. 아파트에
Biology,
사는 뭐
and
소나무,
it's
철쭉 이런 뭐
a
아파트 하나에 있는 꽃들이라든가
story about
아파트에
flowers
사는
that we
뭐
see in our
모기,
apartment
개미, 뭐 이런
apartment
것들, 그런
units,
것들이 어우러져서
and stories of
아파트에서
insects
어떻게
like
살고
mosquitoes that we
있는지
see in the housing units in Korea.
해설한 뭐 이런 나름대로의
And it takes a
재미삼아 읽을 만한 그런 과학
scientific
교양서인데
perspective
그런
on
거
such
써서
little
뭐
critters and
아마 저는 지금
flowers.
실물을 갖고 있고요.
It's quite fun.
아마 곧 있어서 주문하시면
I think that if you order it, you can get it delivered to your house right now. You can order it on the internet. I also wrote an essay. I wrote another sci-fi book. And I do have a few books that I plan to publish. I have been writing quite avidly. And to talk about some Korean monsters that could be applied to Greenland, of course I have some cases. Just wait a minute. I'll bring a book. So this is a book about dragons. And we have dragons everywhere in the world. It's a book about the descendants of dragons. So I think that Greenlanders would be able to enjoy the book. It got good reviews, and it could become a television series or a movie soon. So I talked about these monster stories
괴물 이야기, 전설 이런 걸 관심을 갖게 됐던 거거든요. 그래서
because
그런
I was wondering
유용한
if
소설 같은 것도
we
앞으로
could
계속 많이 쓰게
take
될
more
것이다.
looks into these monster stories across cultures. So I will talk about more fun monster stories in the future. Thank you. I hope you write more and impart great knowledge with your fun stories. Now we have the very last question for writer Kim In-suk. I am a teacher in the Northern District of Canada. I empathize with what you said greatly. In Canada, we call mermaids sadness and we call whales mutuk. I'm quite surprised because I thought that it would only snow, but it's raining as well here. I think that this is because of climate change, and I wonder if it's raining a lot in Greenland as well.
제가 프레젠테이션에서
Yes.
보여드렸던 고래고기는
The picture of the whale meat that I showed in the presentation is called mattak in Greenland and mutuk in Canada. It's the same part. I feel like this year there's been much more rain in Greenland. I do feel that as well. We heard that icebergs have been melting at record speed in the news. And Nuuk is small, but it is still a city. So I think it's difficult for people who live their daily lives in the region to feel the effects of climate change greatly, actually. But I think people who fish, who are in the fishing industry, feel the impact of climate change a lot more than me. For instance, I heard that there's a lot of different fish that are being caught these days. I think for people like me, so city dwellers, can't feel the great climate change upon us. Thank you for your answers. Thank you for the great answers to all the questions that have been asked real time. I also visited the Arctic region more than 33 times. And I feel like listening to all of your talks, I still have a lot to learn about the Arctic. I will conduct more research in the Arctic. Today we have speakers from the United States, Greenland, and Korea, and I'd like to thank them once again also. Thank you to all the participants around the world joining us despite the time difference online. And I hope that Arctic Connect enhanced your knowledge of the Arctic. And this wraps up our conference for today. Thank you to the three presenters. Thank you, everybody.